As many regular viewers will know, the channel has just celebrated its first anniversary. And so I thought this would be a really great opportunity to do another question and answer video. I really enjoyed doing the first one and I think it had a fantastic response, and I've had so many great questions for this one. So let's dive in. Hello, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay. If you're new to the channel, here I look at international relations, statehood, independence, and the origins of countries. So the first question comes from Finbar Nolan, who asks, is there a possibility that colonial borders in Africa may be redressed in the near or distant future, since recent projects like the Plan for the African Union Passport might indicate that those borders are starting to break down or become less relevant? I think this is a really great question because it hits at a fundamental problem of the way that we think of those borders in Africa. And one thing that keeps coming up is people will say, but these are, these straight lines that were drawn on the maps by European powers. Is there a way to address them? That can we redraw them? We see that it's caused a lot of conflict, and absolutely it has. We can see how different groups were divided by those lines and then found themselves in separate states. The problem, of course, is how then do you now open the issue of those boundaries without causing massive conflict? And I think this is the problem that we always saw with the Wilsonian notion of self-determination. This idea that if you give people their own national homelands, then that would solve a lot of problems, that it's a natural right. But of course, the world is not so simple. Groups don't live in nice, discrete areas. And lots of groups may live in a roughly same area. And how then do you start to privilege one group over another? And I think this was always what was really interesting, that what we saw with those colonial boundaries in Africa was that when those countries became independent, they started to jealously guard those borders, because I think they realized that as imperfect as they were borders that could be accepted. They could be accepted by one another on the whole and by the international community. And that if you then start to look at how you can redraw them to make them more accurately reflect different ethnic groups, then in actual fact you were potentially creating far more problems than you were solving by this. And so, although it has created those problems, there was this sense that maybe better to leave things as they are. But it is still nevertheless deeply unsatisfactory. And I think this reflects a really interesting new direction in the way that we think about the relevance of borders in the modern world. And I think obviously we can see a first example of this within the European Union, that you will still have national states, but the idea of borders between those national states has broken down. That we now have open borders, not just sort of open in terms of sort of freedom of movement of people, but also of goods, of services. And so you get rid of a lot of the worst aspects of those boundaries. And I think, we've seen the benefits that have brought, for example, in the question of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And this is why Brexit, for example, has been so fundamentally destabilizing, because you had a peace agreement that had essentially been created by making those borders less relevant. And I think this is what we could be seeing also developing in Africa, which I think would be a very positive way of dealing with a lot of the issues that have come up from the drawing of these boundaries as lines on map that didn't really take into account the local effects. So I think this is a really interesting point, and I certainly would hope that this might be the way of alleviating, not necessarily solving, but certainly alleviating the worst aspects of many border problems. Not necessarily just in Africa, but I think in many other places. We're already, as I said, seeing it in Europe, but are there other parts of the world where creating more open borders, allowing people to cross over much more easily, allowing greater economic cooperation across those boundaries, breaking them down, I think it could be hugely beneficial. So it's really interesting to see this happening in Africa, and I think really ultimately is for the good. So the second question comes from the always brilliant geography world. If any of you aren't aware, do check out the channel. I'll put a link below. Which dispute is most likely to start a war? For example, the recent violence in the Caucasus due to Nagorno-Karabakh. Where will be next? You know, if you'd asked me sort of 6 months ago, a year ago, which of all the frozen conflicts around the world worried me the most, I would definitely have said it was Nagorno-Karabakh. Not just because it seemed clear that it was moving in the direction of conflict, but because I think there's a real fear of just how dangerous that conflict could be, and the effects that a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh could really be. And I think this is something that we've seen, and I don't think that this issue is getting enough international attention. You know, what we are seeing, as many people have pointed out, is a humanitarian catastrophe. So in many ways, the case that I would have identified as the one that I was most worried about descending into war is the one that has, in actual fact, gone in that direction. In terms of where we'll be next, I think it's incredibly difficult to say. Partly because I think we've got a lot of frozen conflicts, but one thing we know about frozen conflicts is that, you know, relatively small things can sometimes throw them out and lead to new conflict. But at the same time, there's none apart from that Nagorno-Karabakh that immediately jumps out at me as being one that I think could sort of explode, if you like, anytime soon. That was the one that I had my eye on. So I don't know is the simple answer. I'm not ready really to put a prediction on this. Which ones? I think the ones that I would really be focusing on, though, are the ones, the low level, the low intensity conflicts that are already going on, which are just getting no international attention at all. So I think, you know, for example, very, very few people are aware of the issue in Cameroon and the campaign for an independent Ambazonia, for example. This is becoming one of the bloodiest conflicts in the world. And it's probably the most dangerous conflict taking place in Africa at the moment. And yet very, very few people have heard about it. So I think rather than sort of look at which ones, you know, which conflicts could lead to another war, I think it's actually better to now be focusing on those conflicts which are getting more and more serious, but just don't seem to be getting as much international attention as they should. Next question, P. Fukanan. What do you make of Democrats in the US already stating their intent of giving Puerto Rico statehood ahead of the election? This is a really interesting debate that seems to be developing now, that there are Democrats who are saying, look, if we win the presidency and if we win Congress, then maybe it's time to move ahead with creating 2 new states. So one of those would, of course, be Puerto Rico. The other one would be Washington, D.C. And, as you know, regular viewers will know, I've already done a video on Puerto Rico in which I've really asked that question of what its future seems to be. That whereas very few people seem to want independence, there seems to be a split decision between those who would take the current status of a commonwealth, which I think, we can call a colony by another name, or statehood. And yet traditionally there's been an ambivalence in the United States towards the idea of giving Puerto Rico statehood. But I think maybe what we've seen is, this polarization in the United States is such that many Democrats feel that the Republicans have played dirty, not least of all on the latest appointment to the Supreme Court, and that it's time for them to take more drastic actions. And one of the things they can do is convert Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. into states on the basis that those states would more than likely be Democrat leaning. And so that would give the Democrats a decisive advantage, especially in the Senate. And so I can see an interesting logic behind this. But of course, it becomes a bit worrying to think that, Puerto Rico its status relies on, how the mainland American political system is playing out. But yes, it's certainly a really, really interesting debate. And it'll be interesting to see once the election's over, once the dust has settled and we know exactly what's happened, if the Democrats do find themselves in a commanding position, whether they carry this through. And I guess a little part of me is skeptical about this. This has obviously been a long-serving debate, but are we actually going to see something emerge from all of this? So I think my view is that this is a really, really interesting topic, but let's watch and see what happens. Next, ZD Vickery. Is it unusual that European countries are refusing to acknowledge Lukashenko's rule in Belarus due to the fraudulent election? This is such an interesting question because it hits at something that I'm really interested in, which is this idea of recognition of governments. This used to be something that was actually quite a regular practice for states. So on the one hand, you have state recognition and then you have recognition of governments. And it's tended to fall out of fashion that many countries no longer engage in this idea of recognition of governments simply because it threw up all sorts of problems. So you could recognize a state, but once you get into the business of recognizing governments, then it means that, after elections, you're having to get involved in the domestic affairs and make judgment calls. And, after a military coup, what are you going to do? Are you going to recognize this government or not? And countries didn't tend to want to have to engage in those sorts of debates. So, in the early 1980s, for example, Britain stopped recognizing governments and instead moved to the principle that, we recognize states, but we don't actually then recognize governments. We work with what we have or we don't work with what we have. And this recent decision by the European Union is interesting because it sort of seems to suggest, and I think there's been a number of signs of this, that we are starting to move back into a world where, not universally, but certainly more prevalent, this idea of recognizing governments and using this as a way to signal disapproval with governments that have come to power and say, look, we don't recognize you. We don't accept that you have been duly elected as the legitimate head of government or head of state of this particular country. So it's a really interesting development that's starting to come out, that sort of it may be a return to the past. Don't know how widespread it's going to become, but it's certainly, I think, a trend that's really, really worth watching. So next, Ansi Rulamo asks, what do you think is the most unlikely of the current UN members? Any country that became independent only by a historical quirk? This was a fantastic question, and it really it really had me scratching my head. Which sort of countries sort of came about by historical quirk, or which are unlikely members of the UN? Do you know what? I think I have to say that the ones that interest me in many ways are the European microstates. So if you think about it, how is a country like Liechtenstein, which has maybe a population of 35,000 people, is squeezed between Austria and Switzerland, how did that retain its independent status and find itself a UN member? Monaco, the smallest UN member, how was that never absorbed into France? San Marino, this little island of a state that exists surrounded by Italy, how come that was bypassed in the process of Italian unification? Andorra, if you like, squeezed between France and Spain. I think there's so many interesting stories to tell about how these little pockets of territory have survived into the 21st century and are members of the UN, even as tiny members. I think so interesting. I really, really do hope to have a look at them in future videos and sort of give it a little bit more of a background as to how they've sort of earned this independence and retained it despite everything that's gone on around them. There's one other country which I think is very interesting. I'm not going to say because I'm actually planning on doing a video on it in a few weeks, which is actually one of my favourite stories of secession in the modern international system. As I say, I won't say anything more, but keep watching, and hopefully in a few weeks' time, all will be revealed. But that would be one of the other countries that I'd be really interested in really focusing on, and I think actually did become independent by a weird historical quirk, so to say. So the next question from Al Cabo. You talk about nation states separating often, but what nations do you think are most likely to join together? Again, this is such an interesting question to ask because I do think of this a lot. You know, we've got this idea of state merger, and you know, one thing that has really come out from doing the videos is just how many unsuccessful cases of state merger there were. That even communities, countries, territories that felt there was like a historical imperative to unite found that relationship within that unified state rapidly broke down and became a very, very unhappy union. And I sort of find myself talking about this a lot and wondering, you know, have we passed that stage of territories uniting, you know, independent states coming together to form new states? And I think it's hard to identify many that could unite. I think one that, you know, an obvious one that I think for all sorts of reasons we could potentially see is Kosovo and Albania. You know, I'm not saying that I think it's certain. I'm not saying that I even think it's likely, but I think that, you know, that's one that potentially might be on the radar to watch. Another fascinating one that I'm often interested in is Romania and Moldova. And again, I mean, there's a whole range of issues tied up with this, and like so many other, I'd love to come back to this and look at this question in more detail, and I hope to do so. But that would be one that I would also, if you like, keep an eye on. So the next question comes from Arville. Why are there no legal instruments on unilateral declarations of independence and secession? I think this really, you know, this is a great question because it sort of stands out that this does seem to be a glaring omission, if you like, in international law and international politics. But I think it's a question that it rapidly becomes clear why there aren't, if you realise that states have a fundamental aversion to secession. They absolutely hate unilateral declarations of independence because, of course, countries worry about their own boundaries, their own territorial integrity. And the thing that really scares them is that if they open up the possibility for territories to become independent through unilateral declarations of independence, then what sort of effect could that have on them in the future? And so there's a real aversion to unilateral secession in international politics. And states really don't want to create the conditions by which that could happen and recognise that unilateral secession is in fact an option for territories. So that's why they haven't put in place any legal instruments for doing so. But of course, law evolves, it changes, and what we have seen is some circumstances where, you know, this might become a possibility. So one element that has been quite interesting, and I discussed before, was on the question of remedial secession. That there is this idea that in extreme circumstances, a territory that's facing existential threat of gross human rights violations such as genocide or ethnic cleansing might be able to declare independence. But it hasn't been tested as a policy. It's discussed in scholarly circles, but it hasn't really found any meaningful place in practical politics for some of the reasons that I outlined in the video, which is not least of all the concern that countries have that this is an irrevocable step. That unlike sending in a peacekeeping force, that when the situation calms down you can pull the peacekeepers out. You can't recognise a territory as independent and then, when the situation calms down, revoke that independence. And so I think countries are very, very worried about it from that regard. So although there have been these sorts of discussions, they haven't really taken off. Another interesting thing, of course, is the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Kosovo. And that deliberately steered clear of this idea of unilateral secession and whether Kosovo is a state. But what it did say, which was very interesting, is it clarified the point that a unilateral declaration of independence, unless specifically prohibited in a particular case, is not contrary to general international law. So essentially, any territory can declare independence. It really comes down to whether it's recognised. So in some ways, some would say, well, that's a restatement of what we already knew. But it actually was very clearly outlined by the International Court of Justice in that 2010 advisory opinion. So I think we are seeing some interesting ideas emerging in this area, but I think fundamentally states become very nervous about the idea of putting in place some sort of formal mechanism to recognise unilateral secession. So the next question comes from President Torres. Why has there not been a UN-backed referendum in Somaliland? If Somaliland and Somalia joined voluntarily in 1960, why have they not left like Gambia and Senegal or Egypt and Syria? And this touches on a really important question about how these sorts of processes emerge and are managed and are considered by the international community. And I think, the problem that we've seen in the case of Somaliland is that even though it existed as an independent state, the fact that when it joined Italian Somaliland to create the Somali Republic has tended to be regarded by the international community as, well, this created a new state. And then when that union went sour and Somaliland wanted to restate its independence, that it found that rejection. It goes back to the point I just made. Countries do not like secession. And so what's actually very easy for territories, and again, it relates back to this question a little earlier about the union of countries. It's actually much easier for countries to come together than for those countries to subsequently break apart. And I think this is what we've seen in Somaliland. So the question would be, why hasn't the UN granted a right for Somaliland to have a referendum? And, for those of us who've looked at the Somaliland case, and, anyone who's familiar with the channel knows that, I've got a lot of sympathy for Somaliland. I think that, of all the de facto states, if you like, around the world, this is probably in the strongest position to claim statehood and to be a future UN member. The problem, of course, is that because it goes wholly unrecognised by other UN members, that those members aren't willing to pass a resolution at this stage, which is going to grant Somaliland a right to have that referendum on secession. So in many ways, this is the problem, that Somaliland is caught in limbo, partly because, as I say, of the way that the international community has tended to approach questions of secession, even in cases where a previously independent country joins with another independent state to form a new country. That breaking that apart and being able to walk away is incredibly difficult. So, in many ways, Somaliland is a really interesting lesson, if you like, for the problems of these sorts of unions. So Velika Bosniak asks, when you make the scripts, what sources do you get them from? Thanks so much for this question, and it's a great question because this is something that I often think about when I'm working on the videos, is that I actually have quite a specific process that I go through when I make them. And with my academic background, I like to go to the source material. So what you will find is that I've got loads and loads of books on secession and examples, and I'll go and refer to a lot of those academic books. But also, I really like to go to things like UN resolutions. And what you realize is that in a lot of these cases, there were quite detailed reports that were made on a number of situations, especially to do with decolonization in the 1950s and the 1960s, which cast what is probably a long forgotten light on a lot of these disputes. And there's a number of the videos I've made where I've gone back to these documents and sort of looked into what actually happened. Stories that really are barely touched in history books today, but incredibly important in understanding how we ended up in the situation that we are in all sorts of conflicts around the world. So, for example, the video that I did on Western Togoland, there had been hardly anything written on this, and it had become a really obscure historical dispute, which underpins what we see today. In fact, there's been quite a significant change from what happened in the 1940s and 50s to today. But nevertheless, today only makes sense if you go back and you look at those documents, look at the debates that was had about the position of British Togoland and the future of British Togoland and its unification with the Ivory Coast. So I love those opportunities to go back and start looking at those sort of documents, and other related sources, so news sources from the period, to try and get a better sense and piece it all together. And in many ways, this is the side of making the videos that I really love. It's that element of discovery. That in some cases I might know a situation quite well. So, obviously videos on Cyprus or on Kosovo, these are cases that, I've worked on extensively, I've written on extensively, they're very familiar to me. Whereas there's other cases which are far less familiar, and I have to go off and do some research and sort of read into them. And of course, what I try and do is make sense of bigger debates and why these are important. But going off and trying to find out. And then occasionally there will be ones which are really, really obscure and very little known. And it's going off, and those I find terribly exciting. So, what I would say is that I use a whole range of sources. And that leads me really nicely into the final question from Filippo Ardizone. How much does it usually take to make one of your videos? And I'm presuming time rather than money. Far more than, frankly, it should. These 10 to 15 minute videos I usually make actually take a lot of work. And that's one of the things I would say that I hadn't realized when I started out on this. Like many others, I would watch YouTube videos and I wouldn't really think what goes into them. But I can't tell you how much respect I have for anyone who gives this a go, because to do it even half decently is an incredibly steep learning curve, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of learning. So I knew nothing about lighting, I knew nothing about sound, I knew nothing about video editing, I knew nothing really about graphic design. Yes, because that has to come into it. Those little touches that you see, maps coming up and things like that, that you've got to work on those sorts of things. Now, you can download them, but you've still got to manipulate them and sort of put them into forms that would suit your needs. All of these things that I don't think most people who haven't ever given YouTube a try realize just how much goes into it. And that's on top of the time it takes to write the scripts. And I'd say of all the things, the script writing is by far the most time. That's that takes a lot of work, a lot of research to write those scripts, because of course you've got to edit them down. You've got to sort of shorten them and make them a decent amount of time, and to condense a lot of information into something which, you know, is a 10 to 15 minute video. You're talking usually days of work for each video. So yeah, bear that in mind before you judge. That not just for me, but for any videos that you see, that anyone who's put themselves out to try and have a go at this, just realize that there is so many different aspects that have got to be learned. So much time has got to go into making these videos, and but I like to think that, you know, they're interesting. They're maybe covering topics that other people aren't covering, or covering them in a way that you know, I'd like to think maybe has a little bit more sort of authority, if you like, that I'm saying, look, you know, I've spent years looking into this broad topic of secession, statehood, and I'm trying to bring that to bear when I'm commenting on these situations. So hopefully the end result is worthwhile. But what I would like to say is an absolutely huge thank you to everyone you know, who has been so supportive since I started this. You know, all the likes, all the subscribe, all the fantastic comments that I've had. And yes, you know, look, YouTube gets a bad name for the sort of throwaway comments, the one-liners that people make. And yes, you know, I get more than fair share of those, especially on some of the more controversial videos. But I have to say, the quality of the comments that I find on this channel is so high as compared with many other channels, that, you know, I'm not getting those sort of one-line throwaways the whole time, but actually some really fantastic contributions. And I really enjoy it. You know, I've been asked so many, you know, really interesting and engaging questions, which are forcing me to think and sort of like, yeah, why are we doing it in a particular way? So, you know, I'm learning an enormous amount from doing this. So what I would say is thank you so much again to everyone who's shown their support for the channel in whatever way over the past year. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope to make a lot more videos. So fingers crossed. Thanks so much. Bye.